Okay, welcome back to the next section of our lecture. So one of the things that you have to be aware of when you're doing field research is that everything is subjective. What do I mean by that? Well, we're dealing with people. People remember things differently, they deal with things differently, they have different experiences. You might be living in a community that, they have this shared history, but, if you're talking to a man or a woman, you might get different types of information. And there might also be other things that could be wrong, right? There could be different issues, and maybe not necessarily wrong, but the truth might be different. And I think that's one thing that we always have to understand, is that truth is subjective when it comes to dealing with people and how they remember certain things or have certain ideas about things. One of the things we have to consider is when we're talking to someone like a key informant. Oftentimes we will work with key informants, and especially if they do a lot of work for us, especially if they spend a lot of time helping us gain this information, there will oftentimes be compensation. In some cases, it can be anything from, it could be cash, it could be, resources, anything like that, that could help that person and compensate them justly for their time. You can see the problem here, that if, let's say, you're talking to someone and they run out of information, right? They've basically told you everything that they know about a given subject, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh wait, I have more, right? That could be an issue. What if they're making stuff up? It's tough to deal with this, and that's why you always have to be cautious about working with folks and trying to understand the motivation behind why people do the things that they do. We keep this in mind whenever we're talking to our key informants, while we're doing interviews. We want information, and sometimes they want to give us information, and sometimes they want to give us different information. There might be, you might have multiple key informants, but two of those key informants might not like each other. There could be like a family feud between them. Well, they might say that, hey, this guy, did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he might just be trying to make that person look bad. And vice versa. That other person might say negative things about one of your other key informants. It can be really difficult navigating those issues when you're working with people, and they might have conflict within their own community. How do you navigate that? How do you stay out of that conflict and still be able to gain the information that you need? Yeah, it can be complicated. It can be a real pain in the tuchus. It is not fun. But it also gives you information about that community, right? It also gives you information about how that community is organized and what you can do with that information when you are constructing your final sort of analysis. So, understanding people's motivations, especially with key informants, especially when working with someone that has something to gain from working with you. And sometimes it might not even be resources, but it could be something like prestige within the community, right? I've worked with this group of people before, and because of that, I have got more sway in what happens with these researchers. Right? And I've run into this multiple times in my own work, where we have had different departments, different groups of people that have different ideas about how we can be used and how we can be used to benefit them or their goals. So that's always something that you have to kind of take into account when you're doing this kind of work. I think one of the things that is really important to understand when you're doing field research is that it's really tough to teach about it in class. Like, I can sit here and tell you all day about how to go out and do it and some of the issues that you're going to have, but there really is no better way than just by going out and doing it. And it's not always easy, and it can be difficult sometimes to just, try and get somebody's attention and say, hey, can I ask you some questions? And they're like, are you creepy? Because you're acting creepy by wanting to ask me questions. And then, hopefully that doesn't happen. So, yeah, this can be difficult. Again, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is bias, right? If we go into a community with an open mind, that is a skill. That is not something that you can just do, but it is something that you have to build upon, is being able to understand your own bias, your own background, and how it's going to affect your research. You have to develop skills to become a good listener. And listening and having conversation are two very distinct skill sets, right? Having a good conversation with someone versus having the ability to just listen. Americans are terrible at this in most cases, and it's because you'll be talking to someone and then all of a sudden you'll remember something that this person's talking to you, and it triggers a memory, and you're like, oh, I want to share this memory with this person or this idea, and then you start talking about it, and then they're triggered to think about something else, and then they start talking about it, and you walk away, and you might not actually know what was being said in the conversation because you were both talking about your own experiences and not necessarily listening to what was being said. So listening is something that's very, very important. Being able to sit, listen, and intake that information without trying to add your own perspective, right? Your own ideas, your own memories. Definitely a difficult thing to do. But you can do it. It is a skill, and you have to practice it. Sometimes you have to understand that there are subjects that might not be easily discussed in any given situation. You might have say that part of your research is you want to learn about family organization, or you want to learn about marriage practices or sexual behavior. All of this stuff, sometimes it can be too sensitive to discuss in public. Sometimes it can be taboo. These are different things that can be an issue when talking about these different things. Sometimes there's an appropriate place to discuss it. Sometimes there's an appropriate time to discuss. Sometimes you have to wait to ask those questions. Part of doing this kind of research is that you're going to go into a community and then you're going to try and learn about this community, right? And you're going to develop those key informants. And sometimes you might ask them a question and they're not going to have an answer for you, or they're going to have an answer for you, but it might be not the answer that is really true. It's the answer that they're going to give you, right? It's a false answer. And it's because you haven't earned their trust or their respect yet. And that's part of this process, is that, when you go in somewhere, and why a lot of ethnographic research projects take a lot of time to develop. So months, sometimes years of research and working with communities. And only after that amount of time will you actually be allowed access to this information, right? And it might take a while for them to be comfortable enough to share this info. That can be a big issue. And so when you're taking that time to develop those relationships, you always want to record that information. And this is why, it's always good to ponder info, because you might hear something at one point and then 2 months down the line hear something else that conflicts with what you originally heard. But now you're like, oh, maybe there's something more to this that I don't yet understand. This is why it's important to maintain those sort of relationships and to take time in developing them. There's another concept that can be sometimes difficult for us to deal with in a situation like where it's best just to sit and watch. Okay, we talk about like people watching. Again, in our culture, in American culture, oftentimes we are very much driven to go, go, go. We want to go, go, go. We've got step A, step B, step C, and we need to get all of this stuff done, and we should always be busy, right? We should always be busy. We should, even when we have our conversations, like you call up your friend on the phone, and you're like, hey, how's it going? It's like, oh man, I've been busy. I have been busy. Or you ask a friend for help. It's like, are you busy right now? No, I'm not busy. I can help. What do you need? Or I am busy. We need to schedule a time. But being busy is a big aspect of being American, and it's how we also sort of treat our lives and how we assess how successful we are depending on how busy we are. Well, one of the things that we try and do as anthropologists is step aside from that busyness and sit and watch. So we might go to an area, a community area, or a place where there are people that are working or living, and we'll just sit down and watch. And we'll just observe what people are doing and start to assess what's happening there. Like, what is the foot traffic? How are people moving around? How are people interacting? What are they doing? How do they spend their time? And we can only do that if we take the time, take the patience, and just observe and sit and wait and watch. And it's not easy. It is not easy by a long shot. But it's something that if you're doing ethnographic research, you have to be able to do, to be able to recognize what's going on in that community. One of the things that you also have to take into consideration is this idea of mutual transformation. What does that mean? Well, essentially, as a researcher, we do not live in bubbles, right? If you go into a community, if you work with people, you're going to have an impact on them. And vice versa. They're going to have an impact on you as well. So if you go out and you are, you're talking to folks and you're making friendships and you are learning the language and you're gaining perspective from that community, that's having an impact on you. That's transforming you in new ways. You are becoming something new, and you are also having an impact on that community that you're working within. They're going to see you. They're going to see how you dress, how you talk, what kind of activities you engage in. They're going to be watching you as much as you watch them. Going back to like key informants, you might become an economic factor within a community. You might, especially if you're going into a poor community, you might have access to resources that they do not. And that can garner different types of attention. That can both help and hinder your own research, right? It might change how your goals end up looking depending on what kind of resources and access that you might end up having. All of this comes down to trying to keep an ethical and moral understanding with your research. How much of an impact are you going to have? What are the consequences of your being there? All of this stuff has to be taken into consideration. Again, we have this code that's very similar to like medical doctors, the Hippocratic Oath, of doing no harm. So we have to acknowledge the fact that no matter what, even though we don't necessarily want to have a big impact on the community, sometimes we can have an impact on that community. Sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, and we certainly try for the better. Sometimes it doesn't work, and those are consequences that you have to live with. But that's why we take extensive training and try and get to the point where those kinds of mistakes won't be made. When we gather all of this information, and it's time to start doing an analysis. And doing an analysis doesn't necessarily mean at the end or the conclusion of a research project. A lot of times it's taking new information and comparing it to previous information and seeing what it looks like. How does it look? What's working? What isn't working? Do you have new information, and does it contradict old data? So this can be a big issue with how you progress during your research, is coming back and reanalyze your information. Take in the new stuff, get rid of the old stuff. And then also sort of break it down into different groups. There's a couple different types of overall analysis that we do. One is called the EMIC approach. EMIC being the individual, the participant observer, right? Doing the real qualitative research in a community. You then have the edict approach, and the edict approach takes an overall view of a community, right? And it's a lot of it is more quantitative information. A lot of times it can be a much broader observation of a community, and it allows us to take a step back and take a critical look at what's going on and what we're observing. So you can take these two approaches, the personal and the impersonal, the close up and the expanded observations, and try and figure out how to correlate these two different perspectives. And then, of course, once you've compiled all of this information, it turns into an ethnography, right? You've basically created, you've taken all this information, all this data, and you've created a theory about this community, this culture. And so what do you do with this ethnography? Well, things have changed greatly. If we take a look at sort of the historical context of most ethnographers, most anthropologists, and how they treat telling someone else's story, right? Because that's essentially what anthropologists do, is that they tell the story of a culture. In this case, we're talking about the culture of different communities. We're talking about how people live and all of that stuff, and it comes down to interpretation. If you look at even going back, and in some cases now, but not so much, but in the last 40 years and certainly previous of that, a lot of anthropologists would tell the story of that culture in their voice. Right? They would use this, and oftentimes because it's Western civilization that's doing the research. It's the United States, it's Europe, with these certain cultural ideals and experiences, using Western voice, that these stories are told in a particular way. And that has been changing as globalism takes place, as education becomes more diverse and becoming different around the world. We're seeing anthropologists that are stepping away from a lot of the traditional Western idealism behind doing ethnographic research and taking their own spin, creating that particular style within their own community, within their own experience. And this is absolutely fantastic that this is the way that things are transitioning. And the tools that are available to do this are becoming way more accessible. And that, again, is a huge issue when dealing with how people compile information, how people share information. Before, if you wanted to learn any of this, you had to have access to it. And that either meant going to a library or a university to gain that kind of access. Now, with the internet, it provides a much broader access to people that'll allow them to learn and to share that information, to give different perspective out there. So the other thing that I think that really needs to be understood is that anytime that you do ethnographic research and compile all of that information and turn it into a book or a report or a journal entry, we have to consider the fact of time. That when you compile that information and you're finished with your research, it ends up being a snapshot of that culture, of that community for that time. So you have, basically you're just taking a picture of it, and then 10 years down the line, it might look different. That culture might have changed, that community might have changed. And that knowledge is now dated. So all of that information, a lot of it might still be very valuable and still might be very truthful about that community. But we also have to take into account that there are certain limitations that we have to appreciate. And that any time that you read a book about, say, any given culture, that book is dated for that time and what has taken place since then. And that's a really important thing to ask is, how have things changed since this was last filmed or written about? This is probably one of the most important subjects that I like to talk about, and will definitely be on the midterm exam, is this concept of polyvocality. Polyvocality is basically, as the word sounds like, it is multiple voices. Okay, it is multiple voices. Anthropologists and early ethnographers, as we saw in like Dead Birds, you had Robert Gardner, who tells the story of this people, of these two individuals within this community. He tells the story about what it's like to live there, and what it's like to die there, and what it's like to make a living, and the troubles that they might have, and the joys they might share. But that's his voice. That's a singular voice. With polyvocality, as researchers, we encourage people to share their voices with us. And this is where a lot of researchers today are using this process of, instead of using the anthropological voice to share and interpret, we are using the voice of the people that we're actually working with. And in some cases, if it's a different language, then we have translators, and translators themselves have sometimes difficult issues. And this is where, we run into and understand the process of what language is that we can have a different focus on things. There might be a word in another language that doesn't translate into English. When we understand that, we can understand that sometimes things might be missed, that there might be some critical bit of information that isn't being told. So there are issues, of course, but most importantly is getting people to share in the research, share in telling their story, being able to have agency within the research that is being conducted. This is a really important aspect of doing ethnographic research, is that you have to have folks that are aware of what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then have a voice in how that research is ultimately portrayed. When I was doing my thesis film for my master's degree, one of the things that I had to do is I took all of my my research and I created this documentary on graffiti writers. And I put together this story about what was going on and how people, and how they thought about graffiti and what's going on and all the issues. But before I could publish, I had to take that and I had to take it to each one of my participants and say, listen, this is what I want you to watch. And I want you to tell me whether or not you agree with what I'm saying. Right? I took the time to create this, to record all of this information. But unless you agree to the truth that's within this, then I am not fulfilling my end and portraying your life and your community in a way that is honest, right? That is ethical. So each of the participants had to watch and then agree or disagree, or if there was something that was in there that they're like, I realize I said this, but I didn't understand the impact that it might have. Can we change? Can we change what's being said here? And I've had situations like that in the past where somebody might have mentioned a name or something like that, and they're like, listen, I can't have that information out there because that might actually cause harm. And so you have to go back in and say, okay, well, we need to change. We need to make an adjustment. But the important thing is that you're engaging with the community. you're taking your research and you are applying it, and you are making sure that the folks that you are working with have a say in their own story, and that they have a say in their own identity. And that's a really, really important thing to constantly remember when you're doing research and when you're creating a research plan, that the information that you are giving is authentic and true and approved of. Now, there might be differences. Somebody might say something that somebody else doesn't approve of. Those are difficult things to navigate. But again, a lot of times it might come down to just perspective, right? I might say, oh, this is something that this person said. Well, I don't agree with what that person said. Well, that's just what that person said. It's not what you said. There are oftentimes conflicting arguments within communities that they might not necessarily all agree on the same thing. The important thing is to try and create the most honest representation of that information, whether it's conflicting or not. It still needs to be recognized. So here's another part of the discussion, and I think this is a very interesting part. So we're going to do a quick exercise, and I think I'm going to include this in with the discussion group this week. Is what are the benefits and possible complications by letting people tell their own stories? What are the issues? Like, what are the good things? What are the bad things? What are the complications that you might run into? So we'll have you add that in. I'll have that as part of the questions that we're going to go through, so that you can, kind of discuss this. Okay, so we'll take a break here, and then we'll go into the final section of this lecture. We'll see you in a few. Hopefully. Possibly soon.